Hello, English language students. This is a PowerPoint to help you revise language and occupation. You have had this PowerPoint, but what I've done is added tasks to help you revise and go over your notes and even include more notes. Okay, so if you remember language and diversity, the question is always about which aspects of our identity and our lives can affect language use and in what ways. Okay, so the question to be thinking about all the time is how can and how does a speaker's occupation affect their language use? I've said a speaker, obviously it can be written as well. So throughout these slides, I've used some fiendish colour coding to help you develop the idea of language levels and language concepts. Okay, so all the things that I've highlighted in green are language concepts. So they're the kind of terms you should be using in your own answers to make them sound more academic. And then all the things in blue are to remind you of different language levels. So to make sure you're talking about those in essays and in when you're writing about the journalistic articles. Okay, so I'm not going to go all through the PowerPoint slide again about what a discourse community is. Hopefully you remember. Discourse communities don't only mean occupation. Okay, you can be a member of many discourse communities. Your teenage peer group can be a discourse community. The point is that your occupational group does create a discourse community. Okay, and it's not just about lexis, it's about discourses, that is structures of speech. So meetings, one-to-ones with managers, those are discourse structures. So those are different genres of communication. There are also written genres of communication. Okay, so for your revision, what I'm suggesting you do is you write a paragraph in answer to this question. How does your occupation make you a member of a discourse community? And go back over the notes and the handouts and the examples we talked about in class and include examples of occupational language from there. Notes, case studies and your own experience. Okay, examples that fit John Swale's definition of a discourse community. Okay, so, obviously a lot of what we talk about is lexis and semantics, and this idea of there being an insider language. Okay, so occupational discourse develops behind the scenes, those in the same occupation behind the scenes. So we've talked about teachers in staff rooms, nurses in their nurses station, police officers in the canteen. That's the insider group behind the scenes. That's when they're not interacting with the public, they're talking to other people who all do the same job. So these are some of the areas, these are some of the terms we've used before. Specialised lexis, that is restricted occupational lexis only used in that profession. Okay, you should have some examples from professions of that kind of lexis. I gave you some from teachers. We also looked at police language. You should have some from your own language as well where you work. And not just work, remember, occupation includes hobbies and pastimes that this can also work in. There's also specialised semantics, remember that. So although the word is the same, its meaning may have a specialist meaning in an occupational setting. Jargon and slang. Now I appreciate, we were talking about this in the other class, what is jargon? What is slang? Okay, and what we have is a sliding scale. Okay, so you've just got to think of this as a sliding scale of formality. Specialised lexis is formal. Slang is very informal. Somewhere in the middle is jargon. Okay, and it is a judgment call. What you think is jargon, someone else might say specialist lexis. Okay, so I'm afraid I can't be more specific than that. That is what those words mean. And if you think about language, if you work in retail, language that's used for products, processes and employees, that's often where this kind of specialist lexis and semantics emerges. Okay, so just to remind ourselves and think about this idea of insiders and outsiders. The register is likely to be more informal in the insider situation. So teachers in the staff room compared to teachers talking to parents at parents' evening, they're much more likely to be informal in the staff room. Insider jargon and slang is highly informal and not used in the presence of outsiders. That literally defines it. Yes, it's language only used between those people in that profession. And don't forget this idea of codes. Okay, the police use codes. Literally, they have number codes for a whole bunch of stuff. And codes are completely impossible to break. Retail and hospitality outlets use codes for tannoy announcements. So it's when you have to say something out loud in front of outsiders, but they mustn't be able to understand it. Okay, it's not the same as a acronym like DNR. Okay, DNR you could work out backwards, but codes, a code, if you think about spies, that's what we mean by a code. It's something that you only can know if you work in that profession. And as we've talked about quite a lot, this means that there is a certain level of power within the profession when it comes to using that language. And we, if you remember, looked at law and medicine in particular for using what is called restricted usage and restricted lexis, and how in these older professions and these high status professions, lots of the language comes from French and Latin roots. And the key point about that is that occupational discourse exerts power over those who are unable to speak the right language. So everyone within the legal profession knows what they're talking about amongst each other. Any outsider sitting in court is going to feel extremely powerless because they don't actually understand what people around them are saying. So here we go with another revision task paragraph. How is occupational language used to create insider and outsider groups? And in writing that, you find and include examples and you use the terms specialist lexis, jargon, slang, codes. And if at this point you can't find any examples, then you have to find some. Yes, you have to go away and find some. Okay. Discourse structures are also affected by one's occupation. The way we engage in conversation in a work or occupational setting is different to how we engage in conversation just casually among friends. One of the biggest differences is that when we're talking at work, it's highly goal orientated. We've talked about how teachers talk to students, but there's also the way service encounters work, and there's also this term about asymmetrical discourse. Okay, so these are all things you should be aware of. It's a good answer to the question, how does occupational language affect, how does occupation, affect language? Because it's not just lexis and semantics, yeah? You're talking about it affecting a different language level, how it can affect discourse, that is, conversation. So we did quite a bit of work on the service encounters. You analysed a couple of service encounters. Okay, they are different to normal conversation because it's got this goal, it's transactional. The customer wants to get something and the person in the behind the counter wants to sell them something or give them something. We talked also about politeness and face considerations. If you remember, we talked about the difference between American and British ideas of politeness and how that can affect service encounters, and how British people working in American organisations or encountering American organisations can be slightly put off by their different style of politeness approach. So I'm not going to go through service encounters again. You have the work on service encounters. Just to mention that in a British context, there's lots of negative politeness. That the British approach to politeness focuses most on negative face wants, that is, not to be imposed upon. So there's lots of pleases and thank yous because those are ways of showing you're not imposing on someone. Okay, but maybe there's not so much compliments and calling people by their first names. That's more positive politeness, and we do associate that more with American service style. And just the point that in some service encounters there is more small talk or phatic talk, and that's because of the length of the encounter. I don't think this is necessarily going to be something you will talk about a great deal. It could come up in an exam, but I've included it because I think it could be really interesting for a language investigation. Lots of you have jobs, lots of you work in retail, and you could do a really nice investigation into service encounters. So just remember the idea of pragmatics. That is inference and implication, and it's also how power is represented in language. So power relationships can be evident in terms of address. So it's worth thinking about the terms of address used where you work, between colleagues, and the ones that show power and status within an organisation. And then talking about how those people who have power at work, real power at work, may mitigate that power. That is, try to make it less bad or less obvious. That's what mitigate means. If you are very ill during your exams, you can fill in a form that is called mitigating circumstances. Yeah, they are things that make a bad thing a little bit better. That's what mitigation means. So when you mitigate your power, you try to make it less brute, less obvious. And we've talked about some of the ways in which bosses and teachers will try to mitigate their power at work by being polite, by using disguised directives rather than blunt orders. So turning imperatives into questions or statements, and using weak modals like may, might, could, should. Those are ways in which you can mitigate your power. And then finally, the idea of asymmetrical discourse. This is another way that discourse is different at work because managers have instrumental power. And so what this comes out with, what this creates, is a kind of conversational style that's different to you talking to your friends, you talking to strangers just on the train or something. This is the thing about asymmetrical discourse. So those people with power can ask most questions, control the topic, control who speaks, pursue their goals. So things like meetings, one-to-ones, just casual conversations with a manager, certainly when a manager's appraising you or something like that. So that's another way that your occupation can affect your language use, because if you're the person with power, you wouldn't speak like that to your friends or your colleague or your partner or something like that. So in order to revise what I'm suggesting, yes, make notes on all the ways someone's occupation can affect their language use. So that was the question at the beginning. How does your occupation affect your language use? So now you should have notes that cover all the ways in which that happens. Cover all language levels, not just lexis. Okay, so there it is in blue. If you're thinking, oh, what are the language levels? You can go back and see. Include a range of examples from the notes I've given you, from notes you've taken in class, from the handouts I've given you, and from your own experience. Okay, all the handouts are either on Moodle or on Teams, and try and use the language concepts. Yeah, that will really improve your answers. Okay, that's that. Hope it was helpful. Thank you.